Okay, I now call to order the August 3, 2020 Policy Committee meeting of the Belton Independent School Board Trustees. We're meeting this evening under the authority of Texas Government Code Section 551.045 and with the authority of the Governor's Office via video conference to advance the public health goal of limiting face-to-face meetings to slow the spread of coronavirus COVID-19. I'd like to thank our administration and technology staff for making the technology possible for the committee to meet in this manner. This meeting is being live streamed on the board's YouTube channel and recorded. The recording will be made available to the public. Additionally, members of the public who seek to exercise their right under state law to address the committee on an item on the agenda for tonight's meeting have had the ability to do so in the manner listed on the notice for this meeting. As I mentioned a moment ago, to comment on an item on the agenda for today's policy committee meeting, members of the public were instructed to submit their comments to be read into the record. Elizabeth, would you please read any comments that were received from the members of the public?
No comments were submitted.
All right, since we don't have any comments submitted, Dr. Smith, would you go ahead and get us going on item 3 of the agenda for today?
Absolutely, Mr. Alcozer and policy committee members, thanks for being here today. We appreciate you all immensely. In this meeting of the policy committee, item 3A, FN Local says that the board may review, but does not have to approve things like the student handbook. And so we're bringing to you an update of the student handbook today. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike Morgan and Cynthia Bodie to give us a little bit of an update on that. But this is not something we have to take to the whole board for approval. Just to be clear, it says in policy that you may review these things. And so we're using the policy committee to review this item at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Smith, and thank you, board members, for meeting with us today. It's part of our ongoing committee work. I'm glad to have Cynthia with us today. I think this is, Cynthia joined our team back in March as our Director of Student Services, and I think this is her first committee meeting to be a part with us. So we're excited to have Cynthia here today. This is a lot of this work is work that she and Stacy Silveska have both worked very hard on. And it's a pleasure today to come to you and kind of hit you some of the highlights of handbook changes that we would like to look at this year. We have included this in a couple of Friday reports, but y'all also had a lot of other things going on right now. So we wanted to make sure that we did a briefing as well. I wanted to talk a little bit about the process. Or can we get slide 1 of our presentation up? So the process was one of our goals this year. Was we really wanted to take a hard look at the handbook, and we wanted the handbook, and we wanted to make it as collaborative a process as we possibly could. And so we started this way back in the world pre-COVID when we were still in normal school operations, is we started having committee meetings back in January, and we created 4 committees. We had a student handbook committee, we had a discipline committee, we had an attendance committee, and we had a committee that was going to work through some discussions on bullying and Title IX and racism and some of those types of issues that we see on campuses from time to time. And so the work you're going to see today and the discussion you're going to see today is mostly a result of the handbook and discipline committees. We extended that invitation to serve on these committees to all campus administrators, to all district administrators. So we had a group of directors and executive directors and assistant superintendents and campus principals and campus assistant principals. And that's kind of where we started in this process. So we we met between January and March, and we wanted to review our current handbook and gather feedback. And we wanted that feedback to come from campus experiences and discussions with campus staff and teachers, and whatever feedback the campus administrators could bring back to us. We went through all sections. Minor recommendations were discussed and documented. And when we talk about a minor recommendation, that would be perhaps a change in wording for greater clarity, perhaps a clarification of a rule that needed to be applied consistently amongst all campuses where we saw that there might have been a deficiency. It might have been an updated to inaccurate information or something that was no longer common practice. And this year we didn't have as many, but obviously we know in every legislative year, there are some major changes that happen because of legislative recommendations and things of that nature. So as we worked through that process between January and March, we realized that there were some areas where we really needed a deeper discussion. And as the committee worked, so we divided into subcommittees, and we reopened it back to any administrators. And then we also asked the principals to include any staff members from their campus that they would like to be involved in these 4 discussions: student IDs, food deliveries, ISS, OSS, and student dress standards. So those were kind of as we finished the big handbook and discipline committee work, we broke into subcommittees to discuss and take a little bit deeper dive into these 4 topics. Next slide, please. So as a result of that work, we come to you tonight with several areas that we thought you would be interested in hearing about. And if we were to anticipate the ones where you may receive questions, that these may be the areas based on our recommendations of what those questions may be. So we wanted to start with student ID cards. Currently, we use student ID cards in our secondary campuses and at our BEX campus. For the purpose of this discussion, we'll be talking about a change that we would like to recommend, or that we're going to recommend based on our input from our administrators on the secondary campuses. And so we have the old standard. The current handbook says that the lanyard must be worn at all times while at school. It says student IDs will be checked each period of the day, and that students who are out of compliance with ID procedure will be subject to disciplinary actions. As we discussed this with our campus administrators, next slide, we kind of took a path where we wanted to look at, is the current policy or the current expectations effective? Are we really getting what we want out of that? And as a result of that, we also studied other school districts, like-minded school districts or like-sized school districts in the Bell County or Central Texas area, and then also in the extended area as well. And what we found is our administrators felt wholeheartedly that IDs are important, and that students will continue to have an ID. They will continue to have that ID with them while they're at school. That ID is needed. They have to use it to receive meal service. They have to have that ID for entrance to events. They have to have that ID for library and technology checkouts, tardies, all of those types of things. We want to back off the expectation that the ID is presented around their neck at all times, at all parts of the school day, in an effort to spend that time that we're currently spending on chasing IDs around, in allowing our staff to build stronger relationships with students, and also in an area to make an ease of consistency amongst all staff and all secondary campuses. Most districts that we spoke with are using some kind of on-demand expectation, or are using digital IDs, where the IDs are actually presented on their phone upon demand. We would prefer to actually have a physical ID, and we would prefer that ID be presented upon request. So the proposed handbook change would be that an ID be carried at all times while students are at school. Students must present their ID when asked by any teacher or staff while on campus at any school-sponsored activity. And of course, the expectation would be the same as with the current handbook, that a student that could not present their ID could face disciplinary actions if they refuse to, and would also be charged a replacement fee to replace that ID. And so I would entertain any questions or any comments from Dr. Smith or Cynthia, if anything else to add. But that's kind of where, at the strongest of recommendations from our campus staff, that's where we would like to go with IDs for this year. And we feel like it's going to be an effective way to manage students, but it's also going to allow us to focus more on relationships and operations than on being the ID police all day.
Mike, while board members get their questions ready on this one, will you just explain a couple of the examples of why? So why is this a recommendation coming forward? I hear you when you say, hey, we feel this is going to be positive in building relationships, but give us some of the logistical things that people brought up about this.
Sure. Just from a teaching perspective, we would much rather have our teachers being able to greet every student at the door and speak to that student about what's going on. Are they having a good day? Hey, did you get your work turned in? Are you ready for the quiz? Reminder test tomorrow, instead of having to ask each student about IDs if they don't have them on. Also, honestly, the majority of our students have always been very compliant with IDs. Some of the students that are not as compliant are students that we want our administrators and staff to be able to take that time to have positive reinforcement, positive conversations with that student, and not the same negative interaction day after day after day. And the final thought on that is that, I mean, we've had this policy in place for about a decade now, and we've consistently had about the same results. If I know a student, and this is the way a principal explained it to us. If I'm an assistant principal and I'm in the cafeteria and a student walks by and I'm trying to build a relationship to have the student make better decisions, to be a more productive member, maybe of our campus life, maybe even to get that student involved in some things, would I rather take that time to reach out to that student and have a positive conversation, or have to continue to get onto that student about his ID day after day after day? And it seems to have worked well on the campuses we talked to, the districts we've talked to that have gone to it. We're still going to have IDs. You're still going to have an ID to get into the football game. You're going to have your ID to punch in or to swipe for your meals and things like that. It's just, we want to spend that time working on positive relationships and not enforcing a rule that's been a little bit difficult to enforce at times, possibly.
Can we ask questions now?
Sure.
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Mike, for that presentation. The first thing that comes to mind is, and of course this may be a bit rhetorical, but the purpose of an ID is, I guess, multifaceted. One would be for security purposes. Did the committees consult with Pete Ramirez about this and what his thoughts were?
We certainly did. We talked to Pete and we talked to our campus SROs and our SRO supervisors about this as well. And it's not kind of the thinking that no one will ever have to provide an ID. Here's kind of the scenarios we built into this. If I'm a campus employee and I see a kid and I think that kid may be out of area, I don't know that kid, I don't recognize that kid, then I'm going to stop that kid and ask him for his ID, just like I normally would. If I'm an SRO and I see a student and I don't know that student, or that student doesn't appear to be in the right spot, I'm going to stop that student and ask him for his ID. I probably should have said earlier too, another problem we've encountered with IDs is if a student's at the other end of the hallway and I see an ID around his neck, unless I'm face to face with that student, I don't really know if that's that student's ID or not anyway. We've had instances of kids wearing other kids' IDs, kids wearing old IDs, kids doing things of that nature. So we felt like if we had any occurrence where we would have normally asked to see a kid's ID, we're still going to stop that kid and ask him to see his ID, and he's going to be expected to present that ID upon demand. It's just, we're not, we just recommended to look at it that way. But yes, we did consult with our safety and security guys. We did consult with our SROs, and we did talk to safety and security guys at several other districts about how the response or the results they had with this policy.
If this proposal goes through, is there going to be maybe an uptick on administrators and security folks to be asking students more often to present an ID, or are we just not going to ask them unless there's some level of suspicion about a particular kid? I mean, how are we going to approach that?
I think it would, in the spirit of what our administrators want to try, if it was a student if we did not believe they were in the right area, if there was any question at all about whether they were a student at our campus, then we would stop that student and ask them to see their ID.
Okay, all right. Any concern about an 18-year-old kid entering the building that obviously without the ID, they're not supposed to enter the building. So if we're not going to be able to sort those kids out, because an 18-year-old, 17-year-old kid can walk into the building now without an ID at either high school. Was there much discussion about that concern?
Well, that's obviously visitors, undocumented and visitors that haven't gone through the front office and haven't obtained a visitor's tag is always a concern. But our front offices all have security vestibules now where those people have to be buzzed in. I'll be honest with you, at the other entrances of the school during the day, the only ones that are opened or should ever be opened are the ones that coming off bus loops. And we do have security that kind of monitor those areas and see. So it has been at Belton High School when we do have kids coming from outside inside, but we do have limited numbers of doors that are open. It's going to be the same situation. Our security guards are pretty good about knowing who those kids are. If they see a kid they don't know or suspect is out of area, then they're going to stop that kid and ask if they can see his ID or her ID.
You said that the current policy that we have was enacted about 10 years ago.
I think so.
Do you know why that was enacted to begin with? I mean, what was the purpose of that?
I think the school was growing at such a substantial rate, and that was just bigger schools, kids wear IDs, and it was a way to make sure that kids were where they were supposed to be.
You know, I get the idea that instead of having to haggle a kid about an ID not being around their neck every time, that you can, enter in some dialogue and develop some sort of relationship with that kid. But it seems to me that can be done anyway. I mean, if hey, where's your ID? And then visit with them. I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. Why couldn't both things be done? I mean, a crafty administrator or teacher that knows how to deal with kids, it seems like they should be able to do that.
Cynthia, would you weigh in a little on the discussion we had a subcommittee that's specifically on IDs, and if I'm missing an angle of it, would you weigh in on that just for a second?
Yeah, I just think that certain kids are going to react negatively no matter what the approach is to them. They know they don't have their ID and they're being asked about it for the third day in a row. And it was causing some friction according to the campus administrators. And just like Mike said, we wanted to take a different approach, and the campuses felt like this was a better way to do it.
Okay.
I will tell you one situation that I was involved in. Whenever I was an assistant athletic director, I was on cafeteria duty for about 6 years, and I had a hallway. And as those kids came in, those kids were told to put their ID on, and it was generally the same kids every day. I knew that kid knew me. I knew exactly what lunch he had. I knew where he was supposed to be. But we were going to fight about his ID every single day because I was going to do what we were asked to do, and he was going to initiate that confrontation every day over his ID. So I do think I would think that most of our staff are doing what we expect them to do, and if they're told to stand at their door and check IDs on every kid every day, they will. I think what we're trying to do, or what the intent that our campus administrators brought to us is they would like to have that opportunity to take that kid that we're having confrontation with every single day about his ID and try to build a relationship with that student.
Mike, in these meetings, it would give at least me a level of comfort to know that this proposal that's being presented to us had nothing to do with a problem with enforcement of the current policy. Because I don't think that would be a valid basis for a change. So can you tell me whether or not that was part of the discussion was a problem with enforcement?
It was. The first discussion I had with any campus administrators about this is I wanted a justification of it. And I said, why would we, if we're saying it's been for safety purposes, why would we want to change that? And it is 100%. They want that opportunity to build those relationships with students and not be confrontational about IDs. And with our research with other districts, we found other districts are completely happy with it. They don't feel like their safety's been compromised, and they feel like that is just one thing where they could concentrate more on exceptional learning for their kids. And so I feel like it is enforceable. We've had kids in detention for not wearing their IDs. We've had kids in ISS for persistent not wearing your IDs. It is an enforceable rule, and we can enforce it, and we have enforced it. But and like I say, as our high school principals came to us with this in our committee work, it was 100% about, we felt like we could do it. We felt like we could make our campus a more positive place. And we felt like we could do that without having a negative impact on the safety of our campus.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you have any questions? Dr. Montgomery, any questions, comments?
I think you covered my questions pretty well, Manuel. Yeah. No, I mean, I was going to go down the same just kind of security line and just kind of press that. I think we pretty much covered it. I mean, I certainly do like the idea of trying to take a different approach, right? And, you know, going after the sense of community. I don't know. I mean, it sounds like we've done the due diligence, and while it may be counter to my intuition, I didn't do the research, right? And so, you know, I trust that if you guys have, you know, talked to it and, you know, worked in the committee and looked at the other schools, I mean, I'm certainly willing to give it a shot. It doesn't mean it's got to be set in stone.
Right.
I'd like to add one more thing, that Pete did contact the Texas School Safety Center and to get their thoughts on it. And they didn't have an opinion one way or another. And they work with school districts all over the state. They didn't have research that showed that what created a safer environment. So they really didn't have a heavy opinion on the actual, yes, this is a safety issue for schools.
And I think Chris brought up a great point. If we try this and we don't feel like we feel like it has not it's made our campuses unsafe or less safe, or we've created a situation where we really don't know who's on campus. I mean, it would just take a simple action, and we can change this back. So it's not something that the kids haven't had to live up to those expectations, but our campus administrators were adamant that they would like to try this and see if it creates a little better environment in which they work.
Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Montgomery, you have any comments or questions about this proposal?
Rosie, you're muted if you were talking. I'm sorry.
I had the same questions about safety, but I thanks for answering the questions. I feel good.
You know, if I may jump in real quick, just so you all know kind of my take on this, and I applaud Mike and Cynthia for doing the due diligence and working with the campus administrators. Here's the thing that I kind of rested on and why I feel comfortable with this coming forward to you tonight is initially my thoughts were, if we already have kids wearing IDs, why are we backtracking on that? Because I've been a part of other districts without them wearing IDs. But the reality of the situation is that we trust every day for our campus-based administrators to keep our campuses safe. And if they're bringing forward a recommendation that they think will keep our campus safe and help them build more positive relationships with kids, because we know that the number one thing that they can do to keep campuses safe is build positive relationships with kids so that they can know what's going on and what the pulse of that school is. If they really feel that, I felt like it was a worthy step for us to give it a try. And I think Chris's point and Mike's follow-up there about, listen, if we get to mid-year or a quarter way through the year and our staff and our students, it's just not working, this is one of those things we can walk back in a heartbeat. And but I think this gives a voice to our campus administrators in all of this, and we're asking them to do this work every day.
Well, yeah, it's their safety also.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at it, I mean, how many times do you hear about a student who caused the issue, right? Well, they had a badge, right? Presumably, right? And so, you know, how many times is the student versus the outsider? The badge doesn't help you, right? And so, you know, if we could set the stage on, you know, hey, look, it's going to be personal responsibility, and, you know, go down to see something, say something, and build build that positive community, we may actually be better off. So, again, let's give it a shot. What the heck? Let's do it.
Okay, any more discussion on that, Mike?
No, sir. I appreciate the dialogue. These are all these are all questions and considerations that we've struggled with as well. And anytime you make a fundamental change on something like this, there's always going to be room to see, did we make the right decision? And we feel like that we vetted this out enough that we feel like it's at least worth a try. And that's why we wanted to bring it to you guys tonight.
Okay. Well, Rosie, unless you and Chris have any additional questions, I think we can move on to the next item.
Mike's got a couple more things to run by in all of this, man. It wasn't only that change.
Oh yeah, that was just one of our topics. So the other ones might not be quite as in depth. So can I go to the next slide, please? So we wanted to clean up a little language in our food deliveries to campus. This hasn't been a tremendous issue, but it is growing enough that we wanted to make sure there was a couple of considerations. Number one is that campuses are not responsible for lunches dropped off by parents. Each campus kind of works out logistically how that looks and where the drop-off area is and how they check it in and how they notify the student and that forth. But we did feel like we had started to see a substantial growth in food delivery services, i.e. Grubhub, DoorDash, Favor, et cetera. And we just, after talking it through with health services, talking it through with campus administrators, teachers, we don't feel like that's in our best interest to allow food service deliveries for a couple of reasons. One is we don't know for certain who made that delivery. We don't know if the parent told the student, you know, you need to eat this healthy lunch that I've made for you, and the student has a debit card and orders Grubhub for themselves of something else. We can't control who's bringing food for students that aren't their own students through these food delivery services. So we just, at this time, our recommendation for our handbook is going to be that we just don't allow outside food deliveries. If parents want to bring food for their kids, we're all about that, but we won't allow delivery persons to bring food onto campus. And that's just kind of for safety and consideration of following, you know, being courteous to other students. Next slide, please. We're for the first time this is one of the examples I gave you of if we still have outdated language or non-applicable terminology in there. We still had a section on long-term ISS. It's been quite some time, to my understanding, since we've even used long-term ISS. It was originally created for 5 to 20 day placements. And so as we work through this with our administrators, we would not feel like if an offense was serious enough that it would require more than 10 days of ISS, we probably have bigger issues and probably need to look at some type of DAP placement or something along those lines. We wouldn't want a kid to be on campus and be out of class for more than 10 days. So we eliminated ISS. And granted, most ISS placements are only up to about 3 days. We have very few that even exceed that. But removal of the language of long-term ISS, get our ISS staff a little more consistent amongst all secondary campuses for sure, limit it to 10 days, and do away with long-term ISS placements. It would either be up to 10 days on a campus ISS or go through a hearing if it's an expellable offense where we could place that student at DAP if necessary. The goal would be to try to correct the behavior and get the kid back in class as quickly as possible. Next slide. As always, we are working through with our staff on student dress standards. And so we actually wanted to, you can see where we line item the things that we're recommending to take out, and we're in red are the additional items that we would like to bring. We've allowed students to wear tights, leggings, and spandex for quite some time. We've had rules about the type of shirt, skirt, or dress that has to be worn over the top. We feel like this can be very manageable just by saying you cannot have you can't have any midriff or skin showing. You can't have holes or slits in the garments. They can't be sheer or see-through. And we feel like we can accomplish the same thing we've been trying to accomplish with that. We started allowing facial piercings several years ago, and there was a stipulation in here that it had to be limited to one nose stud. It really hasn't been an issue with our campus administrators, and there was also a little bit of, if we're allowing one of it, so that's where we draw the line. You can have one nose stud, but you can't have two, and it just seemed like something that hasn't been an issue, and we were going to try to eliminate that. Understood what students may not wear. sleepwear such as pajamas and our slippers. Obviously, there's all types of like flannel pants and things like that. We have pajama days where kids are allowed to wear pajamas. So we just seem like something like pajamas that hasn't been a big issue. And anything that would be suggestive or inappropriate would fall under any of these other categories about dress standards or what students may not wear. And then we also wanted to, the recommendation was to eliminate sunglasses in the building and take away the hats or caps. Most students will not wear hats or caps in the building, and in most instructional settings, it wouldn't be appropriate to have a hat or cap on. But as far as coming and going, coming in and out, right now, students are allowed to have hats, but they're asked to take them off in the building. We just want to allow students, unless we're having a hat day. So we have hat days several days a year where students are allowed to wear hats. So there's not really a safety consideration to that. And our administrators kind of wholeheartedly wanted to eliminate the stipulation about no hats or caps at school or in the building. And then we would add the terminology of see-through or sheer clothing that kind of gets us out of some of the issues we had with some of the tights and leggings. Is if something is sheer or see-through, then that would be considered not acceptable under dress code standards. So I would open this one up for discussion as well. Any of those that you see concerns or would like further discussion?
Mike, so that means that if a kid shows up with pajamas on, that they can't be sent home? I mean, is that the way I'm reading that?
I'll jump in on this one.
Okay.
I mean, as you know, pajamas come in all shapes,
Right.
and you could have flannel or you could have something really skimpy. The other dress standards will cover the skimpiness, so they would absolutely be addressed. But they didn't feel like a boy or a girl even wearing flannel pajamas was an issue, and so they wanted to eliminate that terminology and address it as needed through the other bullet points.
So if it happens, it's a rarity. The kid shows up in a pair of pajamas.
I would say yes, unless it's pajama day.
Yeah, that's where I struggled with this one a little bit, because I wondered if it would open up doors for maybe some inappropriate wear. But as I studied it, when we have pajama days during homecoming week, we have pajama days during other times of the year. Sometimes they do pajama days as other celebrations, and they convinced me that this was probably a worthwhile recommendation, that it's okay to wear pajamas some days, but it's not okay other days. But anything inappropriate would be a violation, and the student would either have to change or put on appropriate clothing.
I mean, I get that if you can wear pajamas some of the time because it's a celebration of some sort, then why is it prohibited across the board?
Yes.
At the same time, though, the handbook could state sleepwear such as pajamas and or slippers, unless, for some sort of event or with prior approval. That would take care of it too. But you don't think we need to go that far?
I would take any input on that. Is that was one of the ones that we had some pretty deliberate and intense discussions about that, because that's exactly where we were on it as well. Is the hurdle for me was when you have rules that say, well, it's okay to do it when we tell you you can do it, but the rest of the time you can't do it. I struggle with that one a little bit. If it's inappropriate, it would be inappropriate to wear it even on special occasions. And now we could get into the deal of does it affect the learning environment and things of that nature. But as far as from appropriateness and whether or not it was inappropriate to wear, I struggle with that one, because we do allow them to wear pajamas at certain times. So that's how I got over the hump. I would be willing to hear everyone else's opinion on that, though.
Yeah, it's hard to be objective here. These are subjective standards. I mean, there are other people that would look at this and say, well, I don't think there's anything wrong with any of that. It's a subjective standard, I guess. I'm not sure how much objectivity there is here, but I mean, personally, I don't think I don't have an issue with that. If Cynthia says it happens rarely and it would be subsumed in some other part of the bullet points, then I think we can still enforce it. I mean, I've seen people walking through Walmart that I thought they were in their pajamas. You know what I'm saying?
Manuel, I was just going to bring up the same thing. I was in HEB last night, and I know there was a family walking down there, and most of them were in their pajamas doing their grocery shopping. So, but it's interesting, and where I struggle with this one because I don't want kids wearing pajamas to school, but we do enable them by creating pajama days and stuff. But the other thing that I always used to go back to is a former, like in my previous life when I was an assistant principal and a principal, if I got a kid wearing flannel pajamas to school, but they meet all of the other requirements, am I really going to send that kid home and not have him engage in the learning environment because he's got a pair of pants on that are flannel versus a pair that are denim? And so there's a lot in this one. And I struggle with it just as much as you all do, just so you know.
Well, I mean, just like we had in the discussion in the previous presentation, I mean, if this becomes an issue, we can certainly change it.
Absolutely.
You know, that wouldn't take much to do that.
Well, and our intent, if our intent today and the intent of our work through our committees is we miss something on that and there's something we completely didn't see coming, I mean, we obviously can go back and look at that and either clearly define what we're talking about or go back and say it's not allowed unless it's under special circumstances. So I do agree with that.
So if you have a classroom that of 20 kids and they're all in there, you know, half of them have caps on, half have hats on, then they can do that under this new proposal. That wouldn't be a problem, even though the teacher can't stand it, teacher can't do anything about it at that point.
Well, no, the teacher can have classroom rules. So
well, can a teacher have a classroom rule that is in contravention of this policy?
So Manuel, my answer to that, and I'll let Mike weigh in a second on that. My answer to that is yes. And here's what I would say on that is that if they have their a classroom rule set up that says, hey, take your hats off when you come in there, and it's clearly understood and articulated to kids, I think that's a reasonable expectation for kids. It does put us in an interesting situation about what battles do you want to fight and what battles don't you want to fight. Sure. But again, I hate to say it like this, we're already in the middle of that battle. There are some that let it happen, whether we, just being real honest, I can guarantee you there are some classrooms that let their kids wear hats right now. And it's in the handbook that says they can't. And so we're already in this kind of limbo land on some of this stuff. And I think that's why when it comes to student dress standards, it becomes so tricky. Sorry, Mike, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's a great point. And I really have kind of two considerations on that. One is that living in that world and living in the campus world for, you know, basically the last 23 years is we have said that you can't have caps in the building, but we've allowed kids to have caps. So if we don't take caps up. So here's what happens right now. This kid comes in, he has his cap on. Hey, take your cap off. Yes, sir. Walks around the corner, puts his cap back on. The next teacher, hey, sir, take your cap off. Yes, ma'am. Walks around the other corner, puts their cap back on until they get to where they're going, where they may or may not be allowed to wear their cap. So I think it's one of those things that there are those of us that do not, me, myself, I don't believe that gentlemen should generally wear hats in the building. You should generally take your hat off when you're in the building. However, if we're not ready to take those caps up when we see those caps on campus and allow them to come back and pick them up at the end of the day, if they have them on, I believe that kids are going to continue to find those areas of the school where they can wear their hat when they're in the school. I would tell a teacher can absolutely tell kids that if they don't want them to have their cap on in their classroom, it's just like what we do I would give headphones as an example. Some teachers allow students to listen to music while they're doing their work. Some don't. Some allow their students to have their phones out on their desk while they're working. Some require their students to put their phones away when they're working. So, I mean, we already have some expectations that, you know, you're not going to have your cell phone out during class, but some teachers allow kids to do it, some don't. So I think there definitely could be some classroom rules in place if either for instructional purposes, because it serves as a distraction, or the teacher cannot see the students the way they want to, then they could ask those students to take their hats off. But once again, I would go back to, we have cap days, several of them every year. And if you pay $1 to student council, you can wear your cap, get a sticker and wear your cap all day. And so if it's not safe for the other, 171 days, it shouldn't, it's not safe for those 2 days that we allowed as a fundraising option on the campus. So that was another point that I thought kind of stuck out to me to give this one a try. We have cap days. We just do them as fundraisers right now, I think. So.
Okay, Chris, you and Rosie have anything on this particular proposal?
I'll let Rosie go first, and then I got a couple of things.
So I actually have a question. Something came up about masks when we were meeting with the attorneys, that we might need to put something about masks in our dress code. Is that just going to be covered under, well, how are we going to cover that? Let me just ask it that way.
That's a great question. And I'm probably going to ask Holly to weigh in on that. Holly gave us a great kind of a summary of this whole topic, because we've anticipated that there's going to be some issues with masks. And so we do have some kind of our proposal, or probably is going to be to have an appendix with some COVID type recommendations in it. But I would let Holly kind of tell what the law says and what policy says on the mask issue.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you.
You bet. And I do think it would be more appropriate to put that in a COVID addendum, for COVID related issues. But you're going to, got a couple of decisions to make about a mask. And just like any dress code issue, caps, earrings, piercings, and the ID issue to some extent, it is a decision of kind of choosing your battles, if you will, while trying to preserve a safe environment that's conducive to learning. And so the mask is going to fall in that area as well. Of course, with the mask, you have a significant safety argument. And I'm not exactly sure what the district plans to do in terms of requiring students with masks, and so we can come back to that if we need to. But one of the things that we had talked to with the administration about was whether you want to prohibit messages or images on a mask, because you get into First Amendment issues, just like you do with phrases and images and things that are on t-shirts. But the language that you have in your dress code, and here probably not this on this particular slide, but the requirement that prohibits any student from wearing messages that contain profanity, that reference drugs or alcohol, underage drinking, and violence, those types of things can be prohibited. But you do get into some First Amendment issues, actually. And so one of the things that we talked about was, whether you want to have, limitations on what could be on a mask, or if you wanted to kind of deal with issues as they came up. And so what else were you thinking, Michael, or Dr. Montgomery? What else would you like to know about masks?
Well, I think I was just concerned about messages on masks and if they could become problematic, but I think you've addressed my questions, so thank you.
And yes, they certainly have the potential. And what we would follow would be the analysis that the courts have used for kind of t-shirt issues, like cases involving the Confederate flag. And so you look at, certainly the administration can prohibit a student from wearing something if it causes a material or substantial disruption at school, or if they can reasonably forecast that it's going to cause a substantial disruption at school. And we know from the case law that a substantial disruption is a fist fight, students nose to nose, about to engage in a throwdown. It involves things like having to stop the school's, shut down the school's computer system to insert filters and things like that. So we'll have to work through those issues as they come up, unless the board or the administration would like to prohibit all words or images on masks. Whatever direction you decide to go in, it's got to be viewpoint neutral. We don't want our administrators and our teachers to be put in a position where they are deciding or have to decide what they believe is offensive and what's not, because that does expose them to having to make some judgment calls that could expose them to liability under the First Amendment, potentially, or expose the district to litigation in that area.
Holly, moving away from the First Amendment type conversation real quickly, I think one of the things that's also come up is, can a school district actually, if we're requiring masks, and we hold students to actually sending them home if they do not wear a mask? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. That is going to come down to, it's very similar to any other dress code issue. Is this something that the administration thinks is such a significant safety issue that the student needs to be sent home from school? And I think most administrators are going to err on the side of wanting to keep students at school in some way, because research indicates that excluding students from school is not ideal for disciplinary purposes, but you do have a compelling safety issue here. And so, and Matt, you and Mike can talk a little bit more about what direction the administration is thinking about, because I'm not up to speed on that exactly. But conceivably, you can put that as a dress code requirement, that for the time being, masks are required for students, when it's developmentally appropriate. Recall the guidance that came out from the commissioner and the governor early on this summer was that it was going to be up to parents to determine whether it was developmentally appropriate for their children to wear masks. And then that changed in July, I believe, to say that that schools can require people to wear masks.
Yeah, I could touch on that a little bit too. As we've worked through this process, the months of June and July, we do understand that under current situations, we would expect students to wear masks when large group gatherings, 6 foot distancing, and some of those things could not be maintained. We also know that some students will have a documented health condition, or it may not be developmentally appropriate or even instructionally appropriate, depending on, for some of our younger students, on what activity they're completing. And we feel like that we will need to have some alternatives available as far as for those students, as far as face shields, plexiglass screens, additional spacing, those types, things of that nature. We've also are going to work through some ideas, and we've been working through some ideas with our principal groups to establish some non-punitive reminders for especially age-appropriate students. If they're struggling with their mask, figuring out ways we can encourage that behavior in a non-disciplinary action, in a non-punitive way. And then we know that we are at some point probably going to get to a point where we're going to have to make a decision on someone who's just simply insubordinate or non-compliant and just says, I'm not going to wear a mask and you can't make me wear a mask. And we're going to have an answer for that. So those are all the processes we've been working through, with some guidance on what legally and through policy, what we can and cannot require. And, realistically, according to TEA, we're going to be bound by any governor directive as far as mask wearing and things like that as well. So those are all the different things that we've been considering at this point. But with directives from the governor's office, that what we have today could change at any time, and we would have to respond to that appropriately to make sure we can still meet the needs of our students.
Mike, are we going to have a policy to look at, of maybe the COVID policy, or whatever we're going to call it, wearing mask requirements? What happens if you don't wear a mask? Is that something that we're going to see? I mean, obviously we probably need to see that before school starts, I would think. I mean, where are we with that?
We're working on it. It's
Okay.
We don't have a final product yet. One of the things we've reached out to some other districts is to see who's making wholesale changes in their code of conduct to address those things, and who's doing an appendix. And so we are most likely going to do an appendix, and we're kind of working through this is new territory, trying to figure out what all needs to be included in that appendix. And we know masks will be front and foremost on that, but there's going to be some other things to consider as well. We're going to need some attendance guidelines on that once we get real clarity from TEA too on what attendance requirements are specifically going to be for our at-face intermittent and at-home learners too. So there are some very, very specific things to this situation that are going to be a little different than what parents and students and teachers have normally had to deal with. And so we're working through those. I wish we had a finished product for you right this second, but we're still working on some of those.
Well, it's a lot more complicated than talking about school IDs. You know, as Holly mentioned, I mean, it's riddled with legal issues that you're going to have to work through. So it's not something that's going to be simple. So, I mean, I feel for you guys and having to go through that and craft something and put something in writing to get it approved and disseminated to the parents of the district, you know, before September 8th. So it's going to be a fairly complicated process, I would think.
No,
And
I agree, and timely as well. So it's a
Right,
timely
right.
process.
So I guess your team's going to have to have Holly involved in a lot of that discussion, I would think. Chris, you had a comment or question about something?
Yeah, I mean, the mask rabbit hole is definitely one I want to go down, but I'm not going to at the moment. It maybe except for one thing, right? So there's 2 paragraphs above the student dress standards in the handbook and one of them basically says, hey, this prohibition includes clothing, accessories, or body art, blah, 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 blah. Like I would consider a mask an accessory, right? And that's where it talks about, you know, depicting tobacco products, alcohol, beverages, drugs, whatever, right? So I feel like from an images standpoint, we just say, hey, look, it's an accessory, it gets covered there. But I don't necessarily want to go down this rabbit hole any further, at least right now. I mean, I've got some feelings on it, but I guess I want to see where we go from here. On the rest of the policy, I think the first strike through that you see on the screen probably just made my freshman's year. Yeah, and so maybe a question here, right? So on the leggings front, you know, there are definitely leggings, full-length leggings that have sheer portions of them, even like below the knee, right? And so if we say, okay, no sheer or see-through, right, and you got sheer on your calf, right? I don't know that I need an answer, but that question is going to come up, right? And so as long as we figure out what that actually means. This on the sleepwear front, I mean, I guess I come from the old school where, you know, dress for the job you want, not the job you currently have. And so, you know, what is the, you know, what is the expectation that we want to hold up for our students, you know, professionally doing their job, right? And so I've got a little bit of heartburn over this one. And so maybe the angle I might think about is, okay, are there any safety concerns with this? And not safety from like a violence standpoint, but safety from a, hey, look, I got to evacuate from the building, or safety from the standpoint of, hey, look, I'm working in, you know, shop class with heavy machinery. Presumably those classes have their own rules anyway, right? But from that standpoint, right, are there any concerns there? And then like Mike, I also came from the mindset of you don't wear a hat inside, you don't wear a hat at the dinner table, you don't wear. And so again, like what is it that we want to instill in the students just from a, you know, cultural, behavioral, this is how you handle your business standpoint, you know, so I have heartburn over those two, but I don't know. Those are my thoughts.
Rosie? Any follow-up comments or questions?
I had the same thought about professionalism with dress code. What are we teaching kids if they can wear pajamas and slippers to school? But I do respect that there's battles that have to be, you got to choose your battles. So, but I do think that there'll be more testing on the limits with pajamas and slippers. I think we'll see more.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're going to see it more.
Right. Well, you know, as we said earlier, we can address it again if it becomes a problem, but I hate to go down that road and have to test something like this and then have to come back and revisit it and then change the policy altogether. But Mike, I'm not sure that I have, I mean, some of the comments that Chris made, I want to echo that, but at the same time though, you guys have met and discussed it at length. And, you know, I know that you're always going to do what's best for kids and what's best for the district and come to us with something like that. So
Well, and like I say, this is, I'm taking notes as we always do. And these are definitely some things that we can go back and look at with our group before a final product is released, and which is going to be fairly quickly, but that's why we wanted to get this feedback from y'all tonight. So absolutely. I mean, as far as the sheer part below the knee, I mean, if we allow, and I didn't think of it in that way, but if we allow, what is the word? You can have cuts or rips, I think, holes or slits in garments, as long as it's located below mid-thigh, then it might be appropriate to allow sheer siding on leggings below the knee too. I mean, I completely get that. So I think without just overstepping and not trying to listen to the voice of our campus leadership and some of those folks, I do think we can go back and look and say, hey, here's another consideration. Let's see where we make sure we land on it before the final product goes. No, I think that's great feedback.
The other thought I had is, okay, if we say pajamas are okay, which is basically what we're saying, I think, and taking that item out of there, then, I mean, what else is going to happen? We're going to get on a slippery slope, and then, you know, more and more students are going to start doing that, and then we're going to see slippers in classrooms, and, you know, I worry about culture. I worry about what are we teaching these kids? I mean, I hate to sound old school, but, you know, none of my kids are going to show up in any of this. I mean, I can tell you that for sure, but, and I don't expect kids around them to do that. That's just a personal feeling about that.
Okay, so I think somebody said we don't have the problem today, but do we not have the problem today because we have the rule? I mean,
Right.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, I mean, are we gonna get going down that slippery slope, and you know, I'm not saying that floodgates are going to open up, but if we're going to start creating more problems, I mean, why take that out? And I know that sometimes we have days when kids are allowed to do that, but those are special events. I mean, you know, in my office on Halloween, I mean, some of the legal assistants, they're going to come in costumes and all that. I mean, that's not something we're going to do all the time, but, or they're going to dress a little bit differently, have different makeup on, that kind of thing. So they understand that. I think kids understand that too, that just because we do it now doesn't mean that it's appropriate any other time. So for whatever that's worth, I mean, that's kind of my thought on that. I'm not sure how everyone else would feel about it on the board, but those are my thoughts about that. Matt, what are you thinking?
I'm going to use the facial piercings as an example. And I think that's one of those things that I sit there and I go, okay, let's just be realistic. If a parent lets a kid have multiple facial piercings, am I really want to get in the middle of saying, no, you can or can't have that at school, right? There's some family level decisions that I think we have to allow our families to make. Am I going to let my daughter have multiple facial piercings before she leaves my house? Absolutely not. But there are some things that I'm not going to judge a family for what they decide to do on some of those things. And I think that's the hard part in all of this, is because we've grown up with a perception of what we wanted to have as a standard in our schools. But I think there's also a role for the family in all of these things as well. And using another example of tonight, here's the thing that I really struggle with, is this idea of what defines pajamas anymore. Because I walk through, and I'm being real honest, when I walk through HEB, there's a lot of different fabrics and materials that are worn through that store all the time. I don't know if I really want our administrators having to get in the middle of what pajamas are and what they aren't. My ultimate goal is, are our kids covered appropriately, and can they learn? And if they are, and they're not creating distractions at school, I want them there and I want them to learn. And so I think that's the hard part for all of us, because we have certain expectations that we have experienced as going through public schools. And we also have family expectations that we've experienced ourselves, either as parents or as kids growing up. And our right balance that we're trying to find is a set of standards that helps us serve our kids and our families well. And so I can go back and forth on a lot of things. The purpose of bringing this to you tonight, as Mike said, was to be able to say, what kind of input do y'all have as board members on this, and help us make good decisions for kids? And so I just appreciate y'all diving into that.
Chris?
I've got one more, right? So again, I'm going to harp on the pajamas here for a second, right? So two things on this. So just because it's okay to wear to the grocery store, and I'm not going to mention any specific stores, right, doesn't mean that that's okay, right? So one, but then two, let me put my CTE hat on for a second, right? As an employer coming in, working with our students, I make some perceptions based on that, right? And so I don't know. I would like to think students aren't going to show up wearing pajamas if, you know, they're doing something in one of their CTE classes, or you got somebody from the outside coming in. But it's really hard for me as an employer not to make some judgments based on that. And right. And if our goal is to prepare our students, I don't know. I guess you could tell which side of the pajama camp I'm on. And I'll leave it there.
I agree with you, Chris. And here's the example that I struggle with is if we don't think that a lot of our boys wear basketball shorts as pajamas, we're crazy. They do all the time, and we all know it, right? But we allow them to wear basketball shorts to school all the time. So we have this mindset of what pajamas are, and yet we know that what's living out and what's practicing and all in the world right now is a little subjective to that. So it's a challenge. It really is.
Rosie, I see your wheels turning. I'd like to hear from you.
Well, I mean, it seems like we put a lot of restrictions, worrying about whether there's a spaghetti strap or how long someone's dress or skirt is. But I think that we're wise enough to know what pajamas are. I mean, and so I think that, you know, we have to ask ourselves, is part of an education teaching professionalism? And if that's what we're truly going for here, then I think it's reasonable to put that in our guidelines. We're not afraid to put limits on other types of clothing. So I guess I struggle with allowing pajamas.
Yeah. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you say, you know, we teach in professionalism, and that goes in line with what Chris is saying about CTE. You have a kid that's going to be working at Disney as a chef, or you know, creating websites for a company, or being a photographer. Then there's certain things that they have to adhere to if they're going to be successful in the workplace. So, I mean, that's just one example, and I'm just spinning off of what Chris had said, which is counter to that. You know, if just because certain families allow it doesn't mean that it's acceptable in the workplace. And what are we doing? We're trying to get kids to get ready to enter the workplace at some point in their lives, whether it's right out of high school through a good CTE program, or when they leave college. So I don't know. I mean, it's those are my thoughts, and I think you've heard from Rosie and from Chris. So I guess you guys discuss it and then let us know what you think. I mean, it's Mike. Anything else about that?
We'll definitely follow back up. Like I say, those are some angles that may or may not have been discussed thoroughly through, and some things that we will definitely take back and consider to our group, and get information to you guys very quickly in a Friday report on any updates.
And Mike, this is just, I mean, we're just, I think everyone else is just trying to be frank. I mean,
I appreciate it.
You got a lot of stuff that you're doing. I know that. I mean, I'm sympathetic towards you. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes right now because you got so many things going on, but and then having to deal with this handbook. But I hope some of those comments were helpful to you, and taking back to your folks, and then making a decision on this.
Oh, completely.
Okay.
That completely. So we wouldn't bring it to you if we didn't want to hear your opinion and perspective on it. So.
What's our next item, Mike? Are you still on?
I do have one page of TASB recommended changes. Some of these are pretty in depth in what I would like to do. And I know that there are going to be some of these that y'all will be interested in, especially when it talks about the comprehensive school counseling program, mental health support, and some of those things. I would like to bring those to y'all in a little more detail on a Friday report, and then follow up if y'all have additional questions, and we could come back and discuss those at a later time. But these are some of the TASB recommended changes in language. We do have, just so y'all know, we have some big federal Title IX changes in implementation and how that process is going to work. We'll probably have some information on for that with you in a Friday report, or we'll follow back up at a policy committee so you can see what's going on in that world. But it's a little different than than the way we've handled those investigations and kind of how those are going to happen and how they worked in the past. But instead of going through these, because this is a very, very brief summary, I would like to give y'all some more in-depth information in a Friday report that you can dig into at your own discretion a little more.
That would be fine.
That's great.
And the last thing is on student code of conduct. Last slide is that since this is a non-legislative year, we don't have recommended TASB changes on our student code of conduct. What we will do is go through, as we always do with our student code of conduct, and make sure that it aligns with our student and parent handbook, and there's no discrepancies there where one has one piece of language and one has another. So that's the last step in this process before we're ready to go public with both, so that parents can have that information available.
All right, sir. Chris, you got a comment?
Yeah, real quick question. So I don't know if it was a week or two ago, we got a marked up or a link to a marked up version of this, and there were some sections that we didn't cover today, like things like absences, what else? Grading guidelines. Are those still being in transportation, right? So are those still changes going through, or are those things that are off the table at this point?
I'll let Cynthia answer that question, and then we can discuss further if we need to.
Yeah, at the time that you received those, we hadn't received the updates from those departments, but we have now received the transportation update and the grading guidelines update. There's still a few little outstanding sections, attendance being one of them, and how that's going to play a part this year, especially. But if you would like a complete, I mean, we're going to finalize the parent handbook very soon, by the end of this week, so we can definitely send that out to you guys.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
We'll make sure y'all get that as board members, and feel free to, if you have ideas and stuff, make sure Mike and Cynthia get those ideas, or you have questions, and we'll follow up with you, because we want you to feel comfortable with what's being changed in there, if anything's changing.
Yeah, I didn't have any specific questions in those sections, but they were interesting to me. And so there were a couple of things that I was just interested in maybe understanding the history on, but I can handle those one-on-one.
Sounds great.
Cynthia, Mike, thanks for everything. Thanks for the hard work that you're doing. This COVID thing seems like it's a domino effect. It affects one thing, and then it's gotten like tentacles. It affects everything. So just know that we're sympathetic to what you're doing, and appreciate all the work that you're doing in addressing all these issues.
Thank you.
For sure, we appreciate you guys.
Mr. Alcozer, our next item is board operating procedures. So there are no substantive changes that we're recommending to that. We're making sure that we remove Dr. Battershell in there and put my name in there, and make sure that we remove Dr. Muller's name and put Dr. Golden in there, et cetera. So those are the changes in the board operating procedures. We engaged in a discussion as a whole board, and we didn't hear anything substantive to make changes at this point, and I have no recommendations from an administrative perspective on this.
One question, Matt, on that. I know that we're doing our board meetings. We're doing the workshop at 5, and then 6:15 we start our regular meeting. And I think I asked you, and I think we decided we weren't going to address that in the board operating procedures.
That's actually the next item for BE local. That's the next item we're going to address it in.
So instead of addressing the board operating procedure, we're going to address it there, right? Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so we can move forward.
Yes, sir. So our next item is policy BE local, and in that policy, it talks specifically about board meetings. And in that policy, it said that we would actually begin board meetings at 5 p.m. The changes that you see there are, we will now notate that to say 6:15 p.m. That is the time that the regular board meeting would start. And then also in red, it says workshop meetings shall be held as needed. So what we're anticipating is we would have a workshop at 5 p.m. Prior to most board meetings, but there might be times where we might not need to have a workshop meeting for that month, and we want the flexibility for the board to know and understand that. So really the only change that we have is the time for the regular board meeting and making sure our public knows that they will begin at 6:15 p.m. on the third Monday of the month.
In the notice, and I don't know, maybe Holly needs to answer this question. If we do a notice and we're going to have a workshop, I'm assuming that the notice has to say that it actually begins at 5, so the public can attend the workshop if they want to. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. It'll
Sure.
be the same, 72 hours notice posting requirements as a regular board meeting, unless it's an emergency. But
Okay.
your workshops would be probably not emergencies.
Do we need to say though in this particular policy, Holly, that I mean, if I'm a member of the public and I read this policy, it looks like all meetings start at 6:15, but it doesn't tell me that the board may engage in a workshop and that I can attend that also. Is that a problem, or are we okay there?
It's not legally required that you put in your policy the typical time for workshop, because in most districts that time varies. It's not held on a routine basis. You could indicate that workshops will typically be held from 5 to 6:15 or 5 to 6 on the same evenings as board meetings, but it's not required.
Okay. So the way that we have it now, we're in compliance and that's not an issue.
Yes.
Okay. That's all I had with that, man. Chris, you have anything?
Just out of curiosity, so would we post in the event that we have a workshop at 5 and a meeting at 6:15? Are those two separate postings, or are they one?
We're going to post them separately so that our public can see both of those as separate, and the public knows that they can attend both of those.
And so then we have to have public comment in both of those.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And the reason, honestly, the reason that we're doing it like this is, let's say, for example, that as a board, y'all would really like to have a budget workshop that is going to go longer than an hour and won't be in front of a regularly scheduled board meeting. You might have that on a Thursday night in January, and this policy gives us the flexibility to be able to, again, post that as a separate agenda. Again, public would still have the ability to comment, and again, we'd still be able to do it just like we, and continue with those regular workshops that we're talking about at 5 p.m. So that's the reason we worded it like this.
Okay.
Rosie, do you have anything on this particular issue?
Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
Okay. All right, man. I guess we can move forward then.
And then the next two, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Lovesmith, and she's talked a little bit about these two with you all already, is from our standards-based grading report that y'all had at the last board meeting.
Good evening. So the first policy we're going to talk about is EIE local. And this policy we do need to change to revise to incorporate our, great. EIA locals first. Thank you. So this policy we're going to talk about in regard to just understanding what's in it, but there are not any changes being proposed. But sometimes when you're looking at EIA goes with it. And so we wanted to just go ahead and let you know what's in this policy. And so for EIA, it does talk about that we'll link grading to our essential knowledge and skills. Guidelines for grading is in that second section. And all that section says is that we will provide guidelines. It doesn't say what those will be, but they are in our code of conduct. And there are just some minor changes in our language for our student code of conduct, where we'll address the standards-based grading. And then at elementary, they're going to remove a citizenship grade. That's just a really arbitrary grade, and they're no longer going to have that. They'll handle addressing behaviors in different manners other than a grade. Also in this policy, it addresses our progress reporting, so that we provide feedback every 9 weeks. Again, it references EIE. That's why I wanted to talk about it tonight. And then it also addresses academic dishonesty. That also is in our student code of conduct. And we specifically acknowledge in our student code of conduct that if it's investigated and found that there was academic dishonesty, there could be both disciplinary and or academic consequences. And so really, like I said, right now, there are not any changes in this. It does reference grading guidelines and some of the work that we plan to do outside of just our bringing in the standards-based grading is to have a greater conversation a lot with our teachers in terms of grading and what grading means and what feedback means and what all that looks like. That is bigger work that we're not going to take on tonight or make changes for. That requires a lot of input, especially from your teachers. And so that is on our docket to do. But for tonight, with both EIA and then, well, just EIA we're reviewing, but then with the proposed changes for EIE, just know we're going to see these policies in the future. We're just tonight bringing them up to make the immediate changes. So any questions on EIA before I start with EIE?
Chris, you and Rosie have anything? No? Okay.
Okay, so with EIE, we are going to propose some changes, and that starts with our standards for mastery. And so we've talked about standards-based grading, and so we needed to incorporate that language. So the first mark you'll see is that an average of 70 or higher or determination of approaches or met standard on an approved learning mastery scale is what we'll hold as a standard for mastery. So now we need both pieces of language in there. And then we need to note that a variety of measures is used to determine that. So this first piece just establishes what is our definition of mastery from pre-K through 12th grade. So that's why you'll see an average of 70 or using those scales from our standards-based report card. Continue. Scroll down some more for me. Thank you. We added in, so we had not addressed at all in this policy pre-kindergarten, and so we felt like we needed to establish that. We do not retain students in pre-K. We actually cannot. Students in pre-K are only eligible to attend pre-K if they're 4, but once you are 5 in the state of Texas, you must begin kindergarten. And so we wanted to just be really clear about that in this policy and make sure that was known. And then we began to talk specifically in kindergarten and 1st grade about standards-based grading. And so here we needed to remove all the language that talked about mastery of a numerical grade and add in our standards-based grading. So if you'll continue to scroll, we would be looking for an approaches or a met standard in language arts, approaches or met standard in math, and then compliance with state attendance. And this would be for promotion. So this policy specifically talks about the criteria that are used for retaining or promoting a student. So for KN1, we would be looking at these determinations. Now I can tell you, in addition to this, just in practice in general, our teachers use what's called a Likert scale. And so they really sit down with parents and have thorough conversations, not only looking at the academic, but just in general, other needs and where that student might fall to make that. But we wouldn't address that in policy. Here we would just put our standard space. And then for grades 2 through 5, so through the remainder of the policy, I really just worked to clean up the policy and make it user-friendly and easier for parents to read. Sometimes when you see things in paragraph, it's really hard to follow the flow and the language of that paragraph. And so in studying other policies and really looking at them, I think this numerical out really clarifies it for parents exactly what. So none of the content was changed from 2 through 12th grade. It was just put in a better readability format. Hold on, go back up a little bit. Except for right here in 9th grade. And so in 9th grade, it did add language that specifically talks about credit for high school may be earned only if you have a 70. So we really hadn't specified exactly what it was to earn a credit. And then continue down a little bit. Thank you. And so I put that in there and put that there was multiple ways in which we determine that grade. So in the prior and previous policy, we just had promotion for students shall be earned on course credits, but we never really specifically said a course credit to earn that, you need a 70. So really wanted to clean that language up as well. Again, like I said earlier, to start the conversation, there is a bigger conversation that we do want to hold in terms of grading and guidelines and feedback, but for immediate purposes, we wanted to clean this up. And then if you'll continue to scroll down, I'm just gonna make sure, and then just a formatting. And that was it. You scroll all the way to the end so I can just make sure. Yes. So that's what we have tonight for EIE. Like I said, just overcap, biggest change is the adding of the language for standards-based grading. Any questions on that?
Deanna, I guess the main thing was just clarifying things. Make it easier to read, and if you're a parent, you can determine what it means to, you know, to meet the course requirements, right? To earn the credit.
Absolutely. It's hard to follow a paragraph, especially when conditions you need to meet multiple conditions. I think a paragraph is just it's harder. And so to really make it real clear for everyone involved that this is what we're holding accountable for promotion.
In pre-kindergarten, can you have a kid that's like 4 in pre-kindergarten, I guess?
So you can, so pre-kindergarten is that you must be 4 by September 1. Every now and then we'll have a parent, maybe I want to say 1 or 2, that the parent would request that they would like their child to not start kindergarten at 5 and us to keep them back. We do not do that according to the state of Texas and to our law and how we are funded. You must enroll in kindergarten if you're 5. So sometimes parents will choose a different alternative and then start their child with us as a kindergartner at 6. But according to our policies and rules, it's at 5.
Okay. All right. I don't have any other questions. Rosie, you or Chris have anything?
I just have a quick clarification. This is all great. I understand it, but you keep alluding to a bigger conversation. Is that a different policy, or is that just a goal that we're talking about for the district?
It's just a goal. It's just a goal. I don't even know if they'll have some impacts on policy. It could. So I just want to be real transparent from the beginning. That as we continue to move forward and as we meet some of our other goals, when I think about the work that we're planning for a graduate profile, looking at what we're wanting for students, and we really need to start talking about feedback and how we provide feedback and how we get grades. Where the change may occur may be more in our local practice of grading guidelines more than policy, but it is something that we plan to talk with teachers about and get their feedback. It's been a while since we've talked through some of those things.
I'll weigh in real quickly. Rosie, Manuel, and Chris, y'all know this from when we first started talking back in January. This policy gives me a lot of heartburn as a superintendent, and I need you to know that. And when it comes to things like GPAs and averages and stuff, I have a lot of thoughts and opinions on some of these things that I think we really need to push our system on. I just paused my camera for a minute just to grab the book off the shelf. So the book is The End of Average. And one of the things that the whole idea behind this is this average creates this false sense of security for people sometime. And I think we need to really dive into some discussions. And I do think it will affect policy EIE local eventually, because truthfully, if we get to a point where we can actually say, here's what we want students to master, and here's how we're watching their progress toward mastery of these standards, that is different than saying an average. And so while this policy, as Deanna has said, I think she did a great job in saying we're cleaning some things up and making it more explicit for the reality that we live in right now. But this is far more a long-term conversation that I do want to engage us in as a policy committee, as a whole board, as a teaching and learning team, is with our teachers, is how do we really assess mastery of the work that students are put in front of them? And how do we communicate that well to students and their families? And I keep getting this image of a 4th grade student going home and talking with their parents, and their parents say, "Hey, I see you got an 82 in writing." And what does that really even mean to a family and to a kid? And I think we've got to start challenging ourselves more and more, not just in Belton ISD, but as educators across the nation, about really, what are we trying to get our kids to learn? How are we monitoring that? And how are we communicating that well to parents? Because for me, and I think for a lot of parents, those grades don't mean a whole lot other than a GPA point. And so I bring that up just as I do think we have long-term conversations to get into in this. And I appreciate Deanna bringing a step in that, in this policy forward to y'all tonight.
Rose, anything from you or Chris? Anything else?
I'm good. Thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, just one question. So the magic number of 70, is that one that we are in complete control of? Is that a state standard? What, just historically, where does that come from?
Oh, I'm a math major, so I never understood why there's 5-letter grades and we pick 70 to start. But when you look at other entities, like for instance, UIL, there's some implications there as to what passing is, and that you have a 70 or higher. So we're not necessarily in control of that, but we are in control when we have a greater conversation and we partner that numerical grade with a mastery level conversation. And what is mastery and what does that look like?
Yeah, I'm definitely in favor of the bigger conversation. I'm not going to throw my school system under the bus where I went to school, but I will say that the number was a little lower. So when
I hear you.
Like, eyebrow went up. Like, okay, okay, all right. I look forward to the future conversations.
Deanna,
Well,
anything?
I'm gonna send you a little excerpt of something that I just, when you brought up that question, Chris, I can't help myself. So I'm gonna send you all a little excerpt just to read over and think about coming up.
Absolutely.
Deanna, anything else?
I do not have anything else tonight. No, those were the changes that we're proposing.
Thank you, Deanna. And thank you for everything that you're doing. I know that you're doing a lot more than what we're talking about tonight. Yeah, a lot of what's coming up, I know it affects you. So
Well, it's a team. We're all working really hard right now. It's a great place to be.
okay. All right, Matt, what else we got?
Mr. Alcozer and team here in policy committee, that concludes our agenda for tonight. I just want to do a follow-up on a couple of things. We were asked by y'all to follow up, or by different board members to follow up on things like food deliveries and stuff, and IDs and stuff. And so we brought these things to you tonight as a way to bring some of this conversation forward. Again, I appreciate the policy committee and you being able to weigh in from a board level perspective on some of these things that we deal with on a regular basis. And I'm open to item number 4, anything that you'd like to talk about for the future.
Not that I can think of right now. Chris, you and Rosie, you guys have any issues for future concern or administrative reports on anything?
I think that's me. Hold on. All right. Yeah. So, you know what? This might have been an outstanding action item from our last full board meeting. I want to make sure we get the, I want to say it's EIC exhibit, where we're talking about AP versus on-ramp credit versus dual credit, right? Like, I want to make sure that we get that on the recurring calendar, so that we could potentially do something with that before next year, right? Review it. And that goes into maybe the conversation we just had a minute ago, right? We need to have a bigger conversation. I don't want to leave that off the bigger board planning calendar. Make sure we have an opportunity to talk about that and still have time to make changes. Right.
Chris, I've made note of that. I knew that was one that you wanted to bring up, and we'll make sure that's on the board calendar for the upcoming year.
Okay.
Matt, Rosie brought up something earlier, talking about the mass, and then we started talking about First Amendment and whatnot. Are we going to have to revisit any of that? Holly, do you think we need to revisit any of that at some point? If so, then you can just visit with Matt about it and then let us know, I think.
by and large, I think that the provisions that are already in your dress code will be the same things that we apply with regard to masks.
Okay.
So I think we'll be fine in that area. But it is also, it's a political year, so there's lots of opportunity for people to use the mask to make a statement.
Sure.
And we want to make sure our administrators are prepared, know how to properly handle those things as they come up.
Okay. All right. All right. Thank you. So I guess if we don't have any issues or reports needed in the future, I guess we're adjourned.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your time tonight.
Thank you.